A few weeks ago, before the trip to the Philippines, studied from Acts chapter 13 and looked at Paul and his relationship with the church in Antioch. Actually goes back to Acts chapter 11. But as you trace, Paul in Antioch, he's brought there by Barnabas, the middle of Acts chapter 11, and then they go away, and then they come back in Acts chapter 13 to Antioch. And then the Holy Spirit sends them away. And at the end of Acts chapter 14, they come back, and they're there for some time. Then Acts chapter 15, they go to Jerusalem, there for some time, and then they come back. At the end of Acts chapter 15, I think you can guess, they go out, and that's where Paul and Barnabas separate in their work. And then I don't remember that we're told that he came back, but for that period of time, Antioch was clearly Paul's home base of sorts. As we read other details of his travels, at times he sent others to places that he was unable to go for some reason. In Acts chapter 20, it's clear if you read the first 13 verses, there is a group that's traveling together, and for some time they're separated. They reunite in Troas, and then there's a group that goes ahead of them, and Paul catches up with them at another point. And at different times, he sent some ahead, or he left and they stayed behind. He traveled with brethren. I think as far as the details we are told, he never traveled alone, but traveled with different ones: Barnabas, Titus, Timothy, Luke. They all traveled with Paul in some capacity and for some time. Each trip had a purpose, or maybe multiple purposes. We're not always told the details. We sometimes can get the high points. He had never been to a place before, so obviously he goes there to introduce some to the gospel. In Acts chapter 15 and verse 36, he says to Barnabas, let's go back to the places that we've been. And so there he goes, and if he encounters the lost, he would have taught them. But his primary purpose for those visits was to go back to the saints and continue to edify and strengthen and build them up. In Acts chapter 14, on one of his many returns to Antioch, it says that they returned and gathered the church. So it sounds like it was not even the Lord's day. But they returned, and then they reported all that God had done with them. And so tonight, I want to do the same, summarizing the trip by looking at what we went to offer, and then also what we received as we went. Just a brief summary about the trip. The Philippine Islands are named for King Philip II back in the world exploration time. And so King Philip II of Spain. And the reason that matters is the Spanish influence in the Philippines is still present, even though that was hundreds of years ago. They don't speak Spanish, but if you have had any Spanish training a year or two in school, when you go over, when they're speaking in one of their native dialects, which they have at least hundreds of, which is interesting for such a relatively small country, but sometimes you'll hear some Spanish words there as they speak. And that also explains why in an Oriental or an Asian country, you have this country that is 80% Catholic. That's not true of China. That's not true of Japan and of that part of the world, or Korea or others. But the Philippines is uniquely Catholic because of that part of their history of the influence of Spain. They have a population of 109 million. And just to illustrate that influence of Catholicism, you see these cathedrals everywhere. Some of you grew up in a Catholic church. I don't know how similar or dissimilar that looks, but you go inside and there are, of course, these images everywhere. And at first you might think, well, if we're a little naive, well, it's just a statue to remind them of someone in the past, but they don't treat it just like a statue. We saw on one occasion, it was the eve of a holiday, and we're driving down the road, and there's a little parade of people walking, and they're pulling these images on a cart. So they're not just something that they look at to remember someone. They treat them with an honor that sometimes borders and sometimes is well into idolatry. For some people who would say, well, but the Bible's not so explicit that that's a problem. As we entered this Catholic cathedral, on the way out, there was this gate, and it's got lights behind it. Might make it a little bit difficult to see, and maybe some of you are not even aware of this. But this is one of the teachings of the Catholic Church. It says, to Jesus through Mary. To Jesus through Mary. And so they have a whole set of teachings regarding Mary and her role as co-mediatrix, co-redemptress. They have a whole series of teachings of that. And so why go to the Philippines? Well, the gospel needs to be there because of the influence of the Catholic Church among every other kind of false religion. Just a moment of geography. So I think you can find Alaska up there. And so the red circle here at the top corner is the Philippine Islands. And so it's to the north of Australia. And then here's a close-up of the Philippines. Just a brief rundown of the trip. This was the 8th time I've been able to go, and every time I've gone with my father. This was his 82nd trip. He went for the first time when I was a senior in high school back in 1995. And so it was. He often goes alone because he goes so frequently, about 4 times a year. And so not very many evangelists that would even be free to go with him that frequently. And so he goes without complaint, is happy to, but it was good to be able to go and to lighten his load on occasion, and then for Joel and I to get to see the work he does and the brethren of whom we hear, to see that firsthand. We left on April the 12th, flew for about 24 hours, and then arrived in Manila, which is the capital of the northernmost and the primary island. This is called Luzon. So we arrived in Manila about midnight, slept about 6 hours, got up early and made it to the airport, and had about a 45-minute flight to a city, to the city of Kauai. And then a brother and his wife picked us up. They drove 2 hours from their home to pick us up at the airport, drove about 2 hours back to their place in Gundaway, and their names are Willie and Catherine Pastor. So we were there April 14th to 16th in Gundaway. Then we drove for at least 3 hours from there north to Gigarao City. And there we were with a man named Rhodey and Tessie Gumpad. There for about 3 or 4 days, and then drove another 3 to 4 hours to Lowog City. We were there for 3 or 4 days, and then we flew from there down to Manila, about an hour, maybe an hour and a half flight, just to give you an idea of the scale there. And then worked in Manila, spent 3 days preaching among a church in the Manila area called the Kapitabayan Church of Christ. We visited 25 congregations. I was able to preach 37 times, and then also taught children's classes on 5 occasions during that last weekend. Some of you helped Starla in preparing some Bible class material. I think we had at least 50 copies of that we distributed. I mentioned to the younger class earlier many times there. There's some layers of reasons for this, but you could not expect that every congregation would have even the series of children's classes that we do. And so some congregations would have no children's classes. Some might have one for maybe ages 0 to 10, might all be in one class. And then maybe by age 10, 11, 12, then you graduate up into the adult class. And so distributed some Bible class material. I also used some of the material that I'm teaching the children in this monthly class, and was able to distribute that, to aid them in that work. And then also were able to purchase 750 Bibles to send back to the places that we visited. And so in all of this, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. I trust that it's understood. Nothing that is said tonight is a matter of boasting in any number or any work. It's all in the context of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Read with me verses 5 through 8. He said, "Who then is Paul, And who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believed, as the Lord gave to each one. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then, neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. So as Paul describes his work in Corinth, that is pretty well known, and then the work of Apollos, we know who he is from the end of Acts chapter 18, but we aren't told much, if anything, about his work in Corinth. But Paul says here, we're a bunch of no-names, that nothing that we have done has mattered. He says, we've done some things. He said, I planted. And when you read Acts chapter 18, that's when Paul planted in Corinth. And then shortly after that, within the book of Acts, then he went from Corinth and then wrote that letter back to them. But Paul's point is, whatever time I spent planting there, who am I? Well, whatever Paul did, Peter could have done, Philip could have done, James could have done, Andrew could have done, any one of the apostles could have done that. And so he acknowledges there's nothing unique about him or his work. He planted, and he mentions in his letter a couple times that when I come, I will do some more teaching on this subject and that subject. So Paul planted, and then he hoped to be able to return and to water. But even in that, his statements are made in the context of, well, who is Paul? Well, Paul is just someone who planted and wanted to do more, but is someone who was limited in what he was able to do. Apollos watered. And again, we don't get to have the details of that. But in the meantime, of course, when you read the book of 1 Corinthians, though the problems there are probably what we remember most about Corinth, the whole church at Corinth was not the cause of the problem. You have the household of Chloe, who was the one who noticed these problems and who wrote and asked Paul for help concerning some of the strife there. So the household of Chloe, even if it was just privately, and even if it was just by their influence, by their participation in the church of Christ in Corinth, the family of Chloe was watering. And though the others who were faithful to the Lord, there were others who were watering. So who is Paul? Who is Apollos? Well, God is the one who gave the seed that's planted. God is the one who made the water that could be spread to feed the seed, and that interaction happens because of God. God gives the increase. God gave the workers that came and went through Corinth, and of everyone that came to Corinth and did something, where are they today? They're gone, and I don't even know what influence even remains in the city of Corinth today. And we could say the same thing about Fairbanks. Glad to have the Mitchells, who were here a few decades ago. And so what work he did here, well, in a few more decades, no one may know that there was a Ted Mitchell here. And a few more decades later, no one will know that there was a David Halbrook here, or me or you. So who are we? We're nothing. We are nobody. And we're only here for a few days. What can we do while we're here? We can plant. We can water. And then even in that, we can't produce any results from that of our own ingenuity, intelligence, creativity. All of that is nothing. The best thing that Paul could do for Corinth, he could build a lot of tents. He could house a lot of people. But the best thing he could do is plant there. And if he had opportunity to water there. The best thing you can do in Fairbanks. There's a lot of things you could do. And a lot of things you can't that you are involved in doing. Not that those are wrong, but the best thing you can do is to plant and to water in Fairbanks. And when we have opportunities to go to other places, all we can do is plant and water, confident that God gives the seed, God gives the water, God gave man a heart, and his heart will respond to God's word. And so you just wait for God to give the increase. And so really the nature of the work in the Philippines is no different than the nature of the work here and in Corinth and in all the world and among every creature where God's people can reach those who are not God's people. And so with his help, we were able to go. What did we do while we were there? Well, first we offered to continue planting. We didn't go anywhere that there had not already been God's people working. So there's already planting happening. And so we just went to offer to continue planting where planting is already happening. A few of the unique occasions of planting and the idea of teaching those who are outside of Christ and still lost. On 2 occasions, there were denominational pastors who came to the different classes and assemblies, and they came and listened. This is one occasion, and the man standing to my left is a denominational pastor. He was met because this man on the far left is a preacher who has a radio program. This other gentleman has a radio program that follows his, and so they've met because of that, and this man has listened to this preacher's program, and so they've had some Bible discussions, and so he was willing to come and listen on one of the days that I was there. So I didn't really introduce him to anything, just planted where there was already planting that happened. And there was at least one other occasion just like that. And then there were other visitors at other times that were able to come to hear, not because we went there and had some kind of grand crusade in a stadium, but because there are Christians who know those who are not Christians and invite them to opportunities like this and then talk to them privately about the things that we talk about. There were some who confessed their faith while we were in some of those places and who then were baptized for the remission of their sins. So there were some opportunities like that, but we did not go and host medical services, clothing giveaways, food distribution, school supply distribution. Read in the book of Acts, what did Paul do when he went to Corinth? He went there and taught the gospel, and he made tents at times to provide for himself, but the church wasn't selling tents. The church wasn't even donating tents to provide for the homeless. Paul could do that in his work as a Christian, or as a citizen, but in his work as an apostle, in his work as a preacher, those were not the ways that the gospel was publicized and that the church established its identity or its reputation by in those ways. The church did so by planting the seed, and so we simply sought to follow the same course. So we offered to plant where there are brethren who are planting. We went then to water, in that language of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, to help what is planted already to grow. And so, of course, we had opportunities to meet with various churches of Christ throughout the areas. Some of the lessons, I had one occasion to meet even with a church that is meeting in a jail, not because Christians were imprisoned for anything, but because sinners were imprisoned for their crimes. And then the man standing to my right is an elder among that first place that we visited, Gundaway area. And so by his influence, 30 to 40 of the inmates there have obeyed the gospel. Will they remain faithful? I don't know, but one has. There's a man who's a member of that congregation now on the outside, and he goes with them. He accompanied us that day, and so he's a man who can be among those inmates, and by his life and whatever he does among them can show. When you're released from these bonds, don't return to the bonds of iniquity. And so that was a unique opportunity. And so we went to encourage brethren such as these. One thing that, because of my father's familiarity with many brethren, he also had the idea that the schools would be out, and so maybe it would be good to do some lessons focused on building up younger Christians. And so as we worked through that plan, then he realized that after COVID, the school system changed, so they've had ongoing repercussions because of that, like we have. And so most of them were not on the holiday schedule that he thought would be, but we still proceeded with that and had a number of opportunities to teach those who were younger. The last weekend we spent in Manila, and so this is the Kapitabayan Church of Christ, and they invited younger people in the area to come. They have name tags so that if we wanted them to read as we were teaching, that meant they would be willing to do that. And so we helped, or they were willing to participate in that way. Some of the lessons that were taught to try to build them up, I taught a lesson titled "There Is a God," and we sung the song that has some points related to that. Dad taught a lesson selecting a mate and modest dress, and that God created male and female, the same agendas that are going on in our country and culture are affecting and influencing them as well. And so he taught on that, and then I taught some from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 11 and chapter 12, where Solomon says to young people, "Rejoice in your youth, and remove sorrow and evil, and remember your Creator." And so I selected that topic to teach several times. This weekend as well, the last part of April and the first few days of May, they have a Memorial Day, just on a different date than our calendar. And so this was a holiday weekend for them. And so most of these young people on that Monday, they were off from classes and off from work, and they came and spent the day in a study of God's Word with us. I also developed some material, as I mentioned earlier, that I used from the class that I teach the younger children here once a month. And so on this same weekend, it was maybe like a VBS arrangement of some sorts. At times while my dad was teaching, I would take some of the younger ones into a classroom. We usually would have about 10 between ages 8 and 12, and taught them over 30 ways that God identifies Himself as the Father and the Son and Spirit and Rock and Lamb, and asked some of the younger ones if you want to know more. I think they know a few of them. And so spent 5 classes with them, and in that time they memorized a list of about 30 different ways. So hopefully, again, these children that don't have as many teachers or opportunities was able to go and plant and water some among them. That's a summary of what we offered. I want to spend also some time thinking about what we received to familiarize you with a trip like this and with the brethren there. Turn to 3 John, verses 5 through 8. What John saw there is what others have experienced here, and is what was shared with us as well. 3 John, verses 5 through 8. John says, "Beloved, you do faithfully whatever you do for the brethren and for strangers who have borne witness of your love before the church. If you send them forward on their journey in a manner worthy of God, you will do well, because they went forth for His name's sake, taking nothing from the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such, that we may become fellow workers for the truth." We received hospitality in a variety of forms, and let me just start here in the U.S. The brethren who provided the means for us to be able to go. Every day we had a place to stay and food, and so that was supplied by you, by continuing to provide for my family as you do each month. And in the hospitality that you extended to my family in my absence, that hospitality is a part of what allowed me to go and even to stay when some circumstances changed. And so we were extended hospitality even by those we could not be with. And then there, brethren opened their homes, opened their pantries, taxied us around sometimes, again, 2 hours each way in various directions. And especially maybe for those of you who can come to the house later, I can explain some other details, but especially there were the mothers were very attentive to Joel and happy to see him, and not them only. There were others who really went out of their way to welcome Joel and to allow him to enjoy some unique experiences. Can suffice that to say. Just as far as some of the food, some of that you would be familiar with for that climate. So the mango there, when brethren would say about, "Oh, you've come, it's so cold in Alaska and it's so hot here," I'll just say, well, the heat makes the food sweet. And so the mango and the pineapple wouldn't be this delicious if it were not so hot. So we can find a reason, like some of you remind us of, a reason to appreciate the cold. And so we have reasons to do that here. Their bananas are smaller, but just as good as any you would have anywhere. And then Joel got into the hospitality business, learning how to cut a coconut, and the milk from a coconut. That's actually what's in these bags here. They say that's one of the best things you can have for dehydration there. So we were provided for abundantly everywhere that we went. And so what John says here in 3 John verses 5 through 8 is, in particular, is especially said about those who were passing through, and then some who came back to John and gave a report of those who were temporarily there. But Peter says in 1 Peter 4 verse 9, be hospitable to one another. So of course that doesn't require out-of-town visitors when we have those among us, like the Mitchells or others on other occasions. Let's let John's word define what we do, but certainly not wait for that. And as we offer what we ought, then we receive much, much more in return. What else did we receive? Turn to Galatians chapter 2. We received the fellowship of the saints. The word fellowship, like other words in our society, sometimes just becomes so general that it almost has no meaning. And so some people will say, well, we had some good basketball fellowship, had some good breakfast fellowship, and it's like everything we do is fellowship. Well, fellowship does have some kind of a unique meaning. For example, in Galatians 2 and verse 9, when Paul and Barnabas came to Jerusalem, they met with Peter and others. In verse 9, when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived that the grace had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So something was given to them that was uniquely shared with them because of a recognition that God is with you. The work you're doing is the same as the work that we are doing. And so what is the right hand of fellowship? Did they literally shake their hand? Well, that could have been an expression of that. So is a handshake always fellowship? Well, definitely not always, because we would shake hands in our culture with anybody that we meet on the street. So everything we do is not an expression of fellowship, but if it is done for the purpose, if it is done uniquely to someone to acknowledge our relationship in Jesus Christ, and that way then there can be a variety of things that fellowship would be fitting of. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 4, here fellowship, notice, has another word that gives, at least in this context, a little bit of definition. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 4, as Paul's talking about the funds that were being shared with the brethren in Judea that he was going to deliver. He says that some gave, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. Well, were they sending a gift and then something else that was fellowship? Well, no. By sending this gift, that was the fellowship. That was an expression that they loved and wanted to provide for the saints in Judea because they were saints there. And so the word fellowship means partnership or participation together. It's any sharing that is done upon the basis of a relationship that is shared with God. And that is something we would not share with all men and with everyone. And so there was fellowship in those who shared the cost of this trip. Those of you who shared in the work here in my absence, that was an expression of this as well as those who shared in the work there. So here's another way fellowship can be given and expressed, was the translators that helped us. Actually, English is taught in the public schools, but public education is not free education in the Philippines. So not everyone is educated. You have to be able to at least provide for your own materials, books and such. So some would not have the financial means to educate their children. But those who are able, then in the public schools, they learn English. One man was telling me that in his high school education, only topics that were specific to the Philippines, like history and culture, would be taught in the local dialect, but math and the sciences, all of those universal topics in the Philippines in high school and then at the university level would always be taught in English. So there's not a constant need for translation, but often you just have a mix of some who understand it very well, those who understand English fairly well, and then those who would barely understand it. And so sometimes they would translate as we spoke. And so I would say maybe 2 sentences, and then they would translate 2 sentences. Well, then, of course, that basically doubles the amount of time that it takes to teach a lesson. Sometimes, though, if there's enough people who speak English, then we can present the lesson, and then one of the men would get up and just give a summary of the lesson in the local dialect. So those who understood the English, they would understand it a little bit better if they heard a summary in their dialect, and then the others could get something, if not as much as others. So those who are willing to travel with us or help us, and in this case, this is where I'm teaching the younger class, and that class would not have been able to go well without this brother Elias being willing to translate. So that was another expression of fellowship. Again, of course, we don't have to wait to travel overseas or for someone to come and visit to look for ways to express our relationship with God's people. We can do that in a variety of ways, publicly and privately, but we receive the benefit that comes with God's plan for the fellowship of the saints. In Galatians chapter 3, Paul made it clear, and there were times where the Jews did not grasp this well, but many of them were growing and maturing. And so often we have different blind spots in our own lives that take some time to grow out of. And so for some Jews, it did not become clear to them for some time that there is neither Jew nor Greek, that there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And so there are a variety of cultural differences, and Paul says the gospel works in every culture. Whatever differences are cultural, the same gospel can work in each place. That's not always true of every world religion. That was not true of the Old Testament. God planned for them to be able to go to Jerusalem 3 times every year. Well, there would be some places on this earth that would be difficult, if not impossible. But the nature of the gospel as it is in the New Testament, it doesn't favor any region. It doesn't favor any race. The basic things that we're taught to do or not do as Christians, you can do equally in any culture. And so in some very basic and simple ways, we saw that. For example, the New Testament teaching of the one baptism being water baptism. Well, sometimes some were baptized in an irrigation ditch. This is just on the side of a road. And so that water was semi-clean. It came down from the mountains, but then this was used for probably for irrigating the rice fields and others there. So sometimes it's that. Here I think we paid about $6 to go to a hotel, and they let us use their water there. So every culture you can find water. You just have to go to different ways to find it. And as in the case here, sometimes we just walk down the road to the Chena River. That's also seen in the different places that the brethren meet. In the picture a minute ago with my father and the man in the orange shirt translating, you could tell it was just a very rough building. And so here it is in the background. You can see it's just got these, well, maybe you can't tell very well, but the dried leaves of these trees, that's the roof. So just a very simple structure. Some brethren have a more stable, sustainable building. Some of them are in the process of building such a place, and so they may have a roof, and on this trip I did it, but I've been to places they had half a wall because they're still buying the cinder blocks to lay another row and lay another row, so they just go as far as they can. Here, these brethren have a pretty nice building, as you can tell here, but I just had this picture. You can see that the chickens are right next door. As you go out to go to the restroom to the right, you're there right at the chicken coop. And so sometimes dogs come wandering in through the building, chickens on occasion. I've preached and there's a dog asleep right at my feet. You're just out in the country. That's the way it is. And so it can be a little distracting to an American, but to a Filipino, well, they've lived that way all their lives. Chickens come through their house sometimes. So not much of a distraction. And so maybe surprising to ours, but you do the same thing. The gospel works in such a culture. This was a picture when I was preaching inside the prison. And so they just had a room there that they were able to borrow and able to use there. And then we had some long drives. Usually, a typical day, we would get up early, drive for about an hour after breakfast to get to one place, maybe drive an hour to go to the next place, maybe visit another, or maybe drive an hour or an hour and a half back. Joel enjoyed not having seat belts, so there's some advantages, but this is just the nature of the work there. Some, not most brethren, but some would have a private vehicle with air conditioning, and so we certainly were glad to have that. And then last, we received the opportunity to learn about some of the different challenges that Christians in the Philippines face. These would not always be the same that we do here, but sometimes just seeing something different doesn't mean one is necessarily easier than any other, but you just learn often to recognize the challenges that others have. It is probably difficult for an American to understand the influence of the Catholic Church in their culture because it's very different here. In our culture, though it's not in the Constitution, and I'm not raising that debate, but we have a sense in America of this separation of church and state. There's no legislated religion. Well, there's no official religion in the Philippines either, but the influence of the Catholic Church on the culture is just much, much stronger than it is in America. And so that's due to our history and to their history. And so that presents just some unique challenges for brethren there. There's obviously the influence of our culture on their culture. That they have malls, they have big cities. They're not all in absolute poverty, and so their economy is changing in some ways from an agricultural to a manufacturing economy. But that's I'm no economist, but they're relatively early or in the mid-range of that transition. So there's still very much so many farms as we go. So that's a staple of their society, but they're transitioning in some way as a society. And so they're having, in some places, some economic growth and improvement. But what's going to come with that is materialism. And with the materialism comes often looseness in a variety of ways. And so as you walk around their clothing stores, then you have the same kind of pictures that you would see in an average store here. And so that becomes a source of influence even on brethren, and then as a part of the influence that they have to fight just as we do. But they also have the challenges of poverty and natural disasters. The Philippine Islands are in what is known as the Ring of Fire, and Alaska is a part of that ring. But here in Fairbanks, we're usually far enough away from the inner part of that ring that we're not as often directly affected. But we're this huge mass of land. The Philippines are a small series of thousands of islands. All of them are not even inhabited. And so when there is an earthquake, when there is a volcano above ground or below ground, then it's much more devastating to a country that already has economic insufficiencies. And so everyone there cannot just fall back on, well, if our house is destroyed, our insurance will cover it, we'll start back where we were. They won't. They just start back. They just start over. And so that's a part of the challenge of life there and that brethren face. And then, of course, every temptation that is common to man is just as common there as it is here. There are brethren whose faith stalls and does not continue to grow. And so brethren fall away. There are false teachings. There is hypocrisy. So whatever kind of sin can be here, that is present there as well. And so brethren face the same challenges and, of course, have the same solution that we do. And so thank you from myself. Also, I can't present the faces or the words, but practically, if not literally, every place that we went, there were brethren who expressed their thanks to those who sent us. And so there are brethren that you will not be able to meet until we join the Lord in the air and are at home in heaven, but who send their greetings and their love to you. I think Starla was recently asked, why are there not more preachers? And I don't know the exact answer to that. But this is one of the privileges of doing the work of an evangelist, to work closely with God's people on a regular basis, and then sometimes on a temporary basis such as this. And I'm well aware I don't do this alone, certainly not based on talent, but the grace of God is with us and with the fellowship of His people. Then opportunities like this are available. I know you shared this trip with me, and I hope you view that as well, and trust that we can continue to do the same work, in essence, that we did there, spreading the gospel to those who are lost, and then deepening it day by day in our own hearts, and deepening it in the lives of each other. And the gospel is God's plan, and is the primary means of God accomplishing that in our lives. And so turn to number 620, and let's sing this song with grace in our hearts to the Lord and to one another. And if there are any here who know that you are lost because of sin, then we want you to know that there is a Savior who came to this earth, who was God, who created this earth. That He was willing to come and to die and to rise to take away your sins. If tonight you need to confess that faith and be baptized, then God will keep His promise and wash you from your sin. As a Christian, He'll keep the promise again if you have not kept your promise to Him. And if by God's grace we are who we ought to be tonight, then let's sing this song with the faith that we will continue faithful until death. But if we can help you in some way tonight, come tell us how as we stand together and sing. 620.